welcome back to another episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. Remember, if you're enjoying this podcast, you can really help us out by liking, commenting, and sharing it with others. Before we jump into today's topic, I really just wanted to chat about why we're discussing today's topic. This is because we've talked about love a lot on past episodes. We talked about loving our neighbor, and if we really love people, we should want what's best for them. But if you're not familiar with the Christian concept of love, it may not make a ton of sense. So that's what we're here to do today. So Travis, right over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rigel. And thank you, everyone, for joining us again here on Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. Like Rigel said, we're talking about love, but from a unique perspective in that we're going to tackle a lot of things that the secular world thinks about in terms of what love is. And we're going to be discussing those things in addition to what we as Christians think love is and why and how different they are. And so, as always, we're going to start with a couple quotes that will help frame the conversation. I'm going to draw upon the work of two people that everyone will know who these individuals are, even if you haven't read their work or know much about their lives. The first is Mother Teresa, who is perhaps one of the best examples we have, certainly in recent memory, of self-sacrificial love and Christian love and the outpouring of Christian love. And so Mother Teresa says, "Love, to be real, must cost. It must hurt. It must empty us of self." So that comes from Mother Teresa. The second quote comes from C.S. Lewis, who people who have listened to other episodes know I am a super fan of. He's my favorite writer. He is also probably the most effective Christian apologist of the last 100 years, maybe even more. And he was a big part of my conversion to Christianity after leaving the faith and being a practical atheist for a significant amount of my adult life. And so C.S. Lewis, when talking about love, writes, "There is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell." So those two quotes, very different from two very different people, both of whom were passionately committed to their Christian faith and come from very different walks of life. And I think the reason I wanted to chat about those two quotes specifically is they hint at, if not explicitly state, Christian love and the self-sacrificial nature of Christian love, which is different than what a lot of people think of as love today in our secular culture, impacted by Hollywood and music and all sorts of other things. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Rigel, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. I think a good place to start is probably, what our secular world portrays as being love. And we get information about this from so many different sources, right? There are apps now where you can find a romantic partner. There are movies. Romantic comedies are all the rage, always. Hollywood is kind of painting a picture of what love is supposed to look like. What we're really here to discuss is this love, or is this an idea of love, but not really what we mean as Christians when we talk about love? So, Travis, do you want to talk a little bit about what the differences might be from what we see in our secular world versus what we consider to be love as Christians?
Yeah, the topic of love is complicated at best. And I would even say that for many people, the topic of love is almost beyond their comprehension if they have bought too much into the use of the word love in music, movies, flippant ways we talk about it. People say, "I love that country. I love that movie. I love this food." And I do that too. I'm guilty of that, but I don't love almost any of those things. I have an affinity for them. I probably like them, but I'll use the word love. And so, because that's the case, most of us, most of the time, don't know what we're talking about when we talk about love, unfortunately. And uh, add to that the complexity of language as a great example. So I'll use a simple, funny example from my own personal life. When my now wife and I were dating, the first time I was learning Spanish to try to impress her more than anything, uh, and I was terrible at it. I'm still terrible at it, but I was learning Spanish for her, and I wanted, whenever possible, when we were sending each other text messages, to use Spanish as much as possible. Now, those of you who know Spanish know that there are many ways in that language to talk about your love for someone. It is, you can say both te quiero or te amo. Both of those literally mean I love you, but the word quiero is the first person verb of to want, querer. And so when it's said, what it means is I love you, but it also means literally I want you. Versus te amo is the from the verb amar. So that literally means I love you. But you can use both of them. So when you come from a place like I do, where you only speak English, you only say I love you, and you use it with a bunch of different people. Whereas in Spanish, you would yet generally use te quiero and te amo in different circumstances. Now, that's just one language. There are a lot of languages in this world. And so the way we talk about love even is complicated. Rigel, I don't know what it's like in the native language that you were born into and stuff, but is there anything similar in your culture where you came from?
Kind of a two-parter answer. The first part being that, in my mother tongue, which is Malayalam, and to be clear, I'm not very proficient at Malayalam, so I like don't hold me to anything I say. But as far as I know, there isn't a super simple way to say I love you to someone. There is a word for love, but to say I love you to someone, I don't think there's a simple way to do that. Hindi, which is the language I grew up learning more of in school, now that has lots of different words for love. Uh, pyar, mohabbat, ishq. There's a lot of different words kind of used in different contexts. Pyar being the most common one. But same thing, you use it kind of to different people, maybe in different situations to express an intensity of emotion. In some cases, sometimes it's more artistic, more poetic, rather than just simple language. So definitely there are examples, and I'm sure in other languages as well.
I think what that hints at is the complexity of discussing love. We don't even necessarily know how to literally say the words when we're expressing it to someone else. And that's even if we actually know what we're expressing. And we might not even know that. And so we won't spend too much time on this, but I think for the benefit of our listeners, the reason that this is something that's important for Christians, especially to think about, is because we say things all the time, such as God is love, right? And so if God is love, I think we should probably know what we're talking about if we're saying that the creator of the universe is that thing, right? And so it should become pretty apparent just from this brief conversation about why this is such a complicated thing, and thus why people that don't grow up in the Christian faith, while they will struggle to understand what these Christians are on about when we're discussing love, and how it almost certainly does not mean what they think it means when we use the same words.
I think most people intuitively know that there are different kinds of love because we grow up with it, right? We have love for our family, we have love for our friends, we have love for romantic partners. There's different types of love. Even within the family, we have love for our parents and love for our siblings, and that can be quite different too. So I think intuitively people do know that there are different forms of love. I think C.S. Lewis did a great job of putting this into words. So Travis, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about C.S. Lewis's four types of love.
Sure. So C.S. Lewis has a lot of great work that for people that are just interested in understanding what the Christian faith is, sort of at a very basic level. A lot of his stuff is very helpful. The best example people will think of is Mere Christianity, which is probably his most famous work. And that book alone was a huge part of me overcoming some of the barriers that I had to the Christian faith when I became interested in Christianity again. But the book that I think is the most helpful with respect to the topic of love specifically is his book, The Four Loves. And so in that book, effectively what he does is he gets at this reality that love is very complicated and there's almost levels to it. And we need to know which level we're actually discussing or acting on to be able to love fully, especially as we try to imitate Christ as Christians and how Christ loved. And so without getting too deep into the details, because this isn't meant to be a book review or anything, but I think it's worthwhile understanding what these four are, and we can then maybe dive into what those look like and how they're misunderstood possibly in our secular culture. So very briefly, the four loves that C.S. Lewis discusses are, I won't use the Greek words, but he talks about them in the Greek. I'll use sort of like the English equivalent. So they are affection, friendship, sexual love or romance would be the third. And then the fourth is charity. And so just as a brief description of what each of these are, first, affection is what we would see between acquaintances, coworkers, even perhaps animals potentially in the same household and stuff. That would be affection, maybe like a general good feeling towards somebody. The second, friendship, takes many forms. And it's the first sort of level of love where we start to see the good of the other playing some sort of role is in friendship. Sexual love or romance is the one that everyone obsesses over and talks about and thinks about. Almost every song ever in popular culture, that's the type of love they're referring to, which is almost equated with just sexual desire, almost universally in pop culture.
And
And
with
so
passion and just like heightened sense of emotion, right?
that's exactly it. It really taps into emotion itself, is what it is. And when C.S. Lewis talks about what real romance is, or real sexual love, or in the Greek, the word he uses is eros, and there are many distinctions and moral implications of it, but this taps into relationships between men and women, and that obviously implies procreation and then family, etc. So those are the things that are covered by this third level of love. And then the fourth one, which is the most difficult for many people to understand, which is the one that Christians care about the most and must care about the most, is agape love, the Greek agape. And this is the purest of the loves, and it is effectively the selfless concern for the other, including obedience to God, which is absolutely beyond our own personal interests and desires. It is agape love is God's love. It is the love expressed in the coming of God into this world as Jesus, and we won't get into like the explanation of the Trinity here, but the coming of God into our form as humans, pouring himself out for us and our brokenness. That is charity or agape love. Very different than romantic love, obviously. And so those are the four types of loves that C.S. Lewis takes time to explain and which are worth us as Christians thinking about and understanding.
So one thing I want to clarify is the first two types of love that C.S. Lewis talks about. There is the one with family and the friendship love, so affection and friendship. The first one is usually associated with family and such, but you can also have a friendship kind of love with family. Is that correct, or am I off here?
I think so. And I think it's also important to say these don't exist in silos, right? Like you can, as a good example, am I friends with my wife? And am I also sexually attracted to her? Yes, it's both and it's not either or. So I think what you're hinting at is some relationships that we have with certain individuals in our lives will in fact cover many types of love, and you want that. Obviously, I think most people, even if they're not Christians, will appreciate that a successful marriage, which is the manifestation of romantic love, is based largely upon a friendship with that person. And so clearly, like, you're talking about two types of love in that single relationship. That's very different than other family relationships, between a father and children, where the romance element is completely taken out of it. And there's another dynamic where friendship probably develops over time as the child grows. A friendship develops more. It's related certainly to romance in that that child exists as the product of romantic love expressed between man and woman, husband and wife. But certainly, there's these don't exist in silos, and so I think we don't want to be too simplistic.
For sure. And I think that's important because, as we said, love is very complex anyway. So let's not try and simplify it. Something that I notice is that with each of the types of love, it's possible to have it distorted more so and ever more so in our secular world. Let's take friendships as an example. You told us what C.S. Lewis defined as friendship, and it's kind of, wanting the benefit of the other person. You're starting to get that feeling of like you want what's best for them. Um, but in today's world, some people will call each other friends, but they don't really care much about each other. They're kind of in that acquaintance mode, or calling each other friends because they feel they can get something out of the other person, as opposed to wanting the best for that person, or what can I give to this person. um, eh, Travis, what else do you notice in our secular world as being kind of a distortion of the types of love that C.S. Lewis talks about?
Friendship, I think, is a great example and one that is worth talking about. And I'm, you and I are finance guys. So we're comfortable with numbers. We like talking about numbers and statistics. And one statistic that is tragic, as coming from the perspective as a man who has good friendships and has lost good friendships, but I have friendships with you as an example, where you and I are friends, and but it goes just beyond like a sentimental warmness. Like, I love you, right? And so I can think about that and what a blessing that is in my life, and I think with the other friendships I have. But a relatively recent study, the latest in a series of studies on the topic of friendship in the United States. I think there's similar studies in the United Kingdom. Canada will be the same. There's no reason to think it isn't. Something like 1 in 5, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 adult men in the United States say they don't have a single friend. They don't have a single friend. They would have maybe friendly acquaintances, but they don't have a single friend. And that's, I think, because when they ask the questions, what they're tapping into, the researchers are tapping into, friendship is beyond just, oh, I don't mind having a beer with that person after work, because that's like 50% of the population. You can have a conversation with someone for an hour, and that's it, and that's fine. That's not what friendship is. Friendship is a bigger obligation than that, right? I think you and I both know that. Like, I consider you a dear friend because I know when I'm in need, I don't even have to ask you to be there for me. You will just offer to be there for me, and vice versa. That's very different than, do you want to go for a beer after work? Okay, cool, we're friends. That's not friendship. And so when the researchers ask the questions of these men and get them to think about what friendship actually is and what C.S. Lewis is describing when he talks about friendship, they realize, I don't have anyone like that in my life. Somewhere 1 in 5 to 1 in 3, like, that's a crazy high number. We're talking tens of millions of men in that one country who don't have a single friend. But I bet you, if you didn't explain the results of that study to the average person in the United States and said, what is friendship? Does everyone have a friend? I guarantee you, almost, like, unless you did the research yourself, you would say there's not one person here who would answer, I don't have any friends. We all have friends, but the research would indicate otherwise.
It's kind of interesting. That gives me some comfort in a weird way. It's it's really sad, like you said, that there are so many people that feel that the research says don't have a single friend. But the fact that researchers are still asking the right questions to come to that conclusion for me is comforting. We haven't lost a sense for what it means to have a friend or what friendship really means. Same thing goes for, romantic love in our secular world. It can get warped and distorted. It's almost become transactional at a point. Let's take Tinder as an example. And I'm sure, by the way, that people have found partners on Tinder and stuff. I'm sure that happens. But when your first instant of meeting someone or, making a connection with someone is not only virtual, meaning on an app, but they are one face among hundreds that you are kind of just swiping through. It takes the dignity of the human person away, I think. They're no longer a person. They are, a photo on an app, and it's okay if you swipe left. They won't know about it. It's okay if they swipe right. There's, to me, there's something beautiful about, in-person human interaction where it becomes much harder to say no to a person because you hurt their feelings. And it's also, more difficult to say yes to a person or go up to a person and ask them out on a date because they can say no to you. But that's part of the human experience. And I think we lose a lot of that with the way the world has evolved.
I want to use two examples that I think to the Tinder example, and there's other apps out there. Tinder is just the one that is top of mind. So yes, I'm certain you're right. I'm certain Tinder or Tinder variants have led to successful marriages. But I particularly like a phrase or whatever that I use flippantly every now and then. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. So yeah, I'm sure Tinder works for producing actual relationships. That doesn't mean anything other than random things happen all the time, and Tinder is a platform where random things can happen. Or likewise, even a broken clock is right twice a day. So, I wouldn't use that as a measure of the success of Tinder. I would say that, those exceptions prove the rule, which is that Tinder is part of the perversion of romantic love or eros in our culture. And it's probably just the logical consequence of a lot of things. And we'll talk about this on other episodes, and we'll get people that understand this better than we do to come and talk about the sexual revolution, radical feminism. Those things very much are related to one another and play upon one another. And the logical consequence of decades of these things, among other things, but these things for sure, is creating romantic love in a transactional setting, which is exactly what Tinder and Tinder clones do. And it's frankly tragic, right? Like it actually is. And anyone who thinks it isn't tragic just hasn't been on the receiving end of the bad things that those platforms allow for. Like, but your day will come, like play with fire. One day you'll get burned. So if you think either you're a sociopath or you're so broken that you don't even realize what pain is, in which case, like my heart breaks for you because that's awful. And you're missing out on much of what makes life worth living, which is love. And as Christians, obviously, we believe that that's the case. And your use of Tinder or whatever it is takes the most profoundly impactful relationships that we have in life romantically and turns them into like credit card transactions, literally swipe, which is what we do with credit cards. I don't know, Rigel, what and admittedly, I speak from a place of ignorance because I've never used one of these platforms and frankly never would. And if that is offensive to someone hearing it, I'm sorry, but that's just the truth. I wouldn't use it because I see it as something transactional. Even when I was a pagan and acting like an idiot and, engaging in non-Christian behavior from a relationship perspective and a sexual perspective, I was doing those things. I'm guilty of those things, but I still never would have used Tinder because I was aware of this is just a transaction. And even though I was behaving in a way that was transactional, I was almost like afraid to admit how transactional it was. So I just stayed off the platform that facilitated it. I don't know, Roger, what are your thoughts or experiences with Tinder or things like Tinder?
No personal experiences with Tinder. So again, I'm biased by, what I've heard other people say, what the news says, the concept of Tinder in general, and how, I apply it to my own life and what I think about it. I think there are levels to what Tinder has done to, let's call it, the dating scene as well. Part of it is that now you can be talking to multiple people at once. Now we know, especially now as married men, we know that love is commitment, and it takes work, and it takes effort, and it takes devotion, meaning, you're devoted to that single person, because if you're not in with both feet, you can't really figure out if this is right or not. Tinder just allows you to have a foot in how many ever different doors you want. And then we'll talk about this in part 2, but just the dating world has changed significantly since I was in it. There's stuff that the younger generation says now, like before there was dating, engaged, married. Those are kind of your Facebook relationship statuses. Now there's a whole bunch more than that.
Including it's complicated, which is
Yes.
like the most obvious thing ever said by anybody in history. Human relationships are complicated. So by definition, you don't need to say that, Facebook, but thanks for the option of the obvious.
100%. And let's not forget the other places where we kind of receive our perception of love, right? Starting from when we're kids, we look around to see what love really looks like. We see it in our parents, we see it from our friends, we see it on TV. So, movies, Hollywood, TV shows, whatever it might be. We also see it on social media. And whatever we see kind of shapes our perception of what love is, right? And I think I see this very obviously today, where these grand gestures that you see in movies, the boombox outside the window, or a surprise trip halfway across the world. Like, these grand gestures are what it really means to be loved. And there's a whole generation that's shaping their perception of love based on that. Travis, your experiences for, what it was like for you growing up, how your perception of love was shaped and how it's different today.
I had the, I'd say, unfortunate experience of going to public schools, which in a lot of ways were great for a lot of things. But formation in terms of understanding romance and romantic love through a Christian lens was not one of those positive things, the very opposite. And as an example, when I was in high school, so I would have been, I don't know, 16, 15 years old, whatever, the American Pie movies came out. When they came out, like, I watched them with my friends and I thought they were hilarious. I thought they were hilarious because they seemed to represent my lived experience in high school of what people were doing. Which is almost shocking now to look back and how normal that was for me. Like, not even to think about hearing stories of hockey players literally having orgies at a Friday night party and then going to school with those same people on Monday. It's like, are we Romans? Are we the ancient Romans here? You wouldn't know otherwise based upon that alone. And so I think what that did to me, even though for the most part, I'd say thanks to the grace of God, for one, the home I was raised in, where my parents instilled values in me, even when I started to engage in some of the things that were absolutely not okay. It took me a lot longer to get there than the vast majority of my friends. And so looking back, I'm so fortunate because I was such a wretch by the time I was in my mid-20s. I can't imagine how bad it would have been if I'd started a decade earlier. And that's heartbreaking because I look back now and we're talking 20 plus years ago now. And so I think about my nephews, my godchildren, and realize, like, in a number of years, if they're in public schools, this is what they will be encountering. That's really scary for me to. What I do is I just don't think about it because it's so scary to think about. That's not a solution, but I don't know what else to do because it's so worrying to me. You went to your school system was different than mine. You were in a private school, not in the Western world. And so very different. I don't know. What was your experience in school from the perspective of romantic love? And I'll use that loosely in air quotes.
I think it was kind of the same as you. It's regardless of the fact that we were in two completely different countries. I think, just because I did grow up with an international crowd, we grew up with the American Pie movies as well, and so, like, I feel like that did shape a lot of what happened and felt normal in school. So yeah, I think experience wise, very similar growing up, but I'm glad now that I've gotten to a point where I can look back and realize how awful that was. So, in a quick 180, then, for a message of hope, we do believe as Christians that all these four types of love that C.S. Lewis discussed are pure and can be made pure if they have agape love, which is the fourth type, as its foundation. So, Travis, can you maybe talk a little bit about how that might apply to each of the loves? If we're looking at love through the lens of agape, how does that affect each of the relationships or each of the types of relationships that we have with people?
Yeah. So I'll do that. And just before I do, to tap into what you said, uh, all of the types of love are good. Love is good. And it doesn't matter what type of love we're discussing. They are all good. They are gifts from God. God is love. And so how can we possibly say that the creator of the universe, who is love, allows some of them to actually not be good? They are good. It's when they are misunderstood or abused or misused that they seem to be not good. But it's not because they aren't good. It's because people aren't behaving in accordance with what those things actually are. And I want to give credit to my friends. My wife and I were at a retreat over the weekend, 48 hours off the grid, sort of, as it were, Catholic retreat, super intense. We'll talk about it on another episode. But during the retreat, there was a talk given by our dear friends, Heidi and Israel, who are husband and wife. And it was entirely in Spanish, so I'm not going to relay what was said because it'll be useless for you. But in English, what they got at was the proper understanding of romantic love per the teachings of the Catholic Church and Christian history. And it's beautiful. Like, frankly, it's beautiful. I left that talk wishing they kept talking because there was so much more that they didn't get to, but realizing it was almost like it reinstilled in me, as someone that is so broken from a perversion of romantic love through my adult life. And this is a source of, embarrassment for me, and probably will for a long time. And I will wrestle with that. But even for someone like me to hear them talk about how beautiful romantic love can be when seen through the proper lens was really encouraging. And so if you're listening to this and you're someone who has a broken past, has misunderstood romance and everything tied up into it, don't be despondent. Don't despair. There is hope in how this can be better understood and used the way God intended it, which was a gift for us. And I think that taps into what you were mentioning, Rigel, about agape love and why all forms of love are taken to the best possible representation of themselves when they're grounded in charity, which is agape, which is how Christ loved. And thus, as Christians, how we are called to try to love. We're not Christ, and so we're going to screw up all the time, but we try our best, and we have to. Otherwise, why are we calling ourselves Christians? And I think charity, when we think about that, charity is perfect love. It is the kind of love that God himself displays and shows. It is unconditional. It is given to us through God's Son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And it really focuses on the wanting of what is best for the other, no matter what it means for us. And that is not obvious to a lot of people whose conception of all things love is ultimately some measure of what's good for me. And charity says it doesn't matter what's good for you. What matters is what is good for the others, irrespective of what is good for you.
And just as a demonstration of what this means in its highest form, first of all, as Christ said, the greatest love that a man can have for another is to lay down his life for his friend. And we see this in Christ himself. To be God and to suffer human suffering for the sake of our sins lay down his life for us is the highest and purest form of love and what we are called to as Christians, because the ultimate form of self-denial, which is what agape love calls for, is denying your own life for the sake of someone else.
And I think that's a good place for us to end part 1 of our talk about love, passion, romance, Tinder, etc. I think we'll pause it there, and we hope people will join us for part 2, where we will continue to talk about this and better understanding through our personal experiences, both Rigel and myself, what seeing Christian love properly expressed rather than the perversions of it that we see, when it's properly expressed, what it can and should mean for our lives as Christians. So we're going to talk about that on part 2, and we hope you join us for that.
Stay tuned.